Hi, everyone. My name is John Gershman. I'm on the faculty here at the Wagner School at New York University. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this event with Professor Walden Bello on the election in the Philippines. This event is co-sponsored by SULO, the Philippine Studies Initiative at New York University, the New York Southeast Asia Network, and the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies. Professor Bello is, of course, well known to all of you. He's a longtime public intellectual and activist. Amongst his many titles, he, of course, served in Congress and headed up the Overseas Workers Committee in the Congress. He was a candidate for Senate. And as of last week, is a candidate for vice president in the upcoming elections. He's a professor emeritus from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and currently an international adjunct professor in sociology at Binghampton University. Walden, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, John. Just a correction. I'm not a professor emeritus at I'm a retired professor, but not emeritus.
Sorry. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, so I want to start off. We'll come to the question of your candidacy and your campaign a little bit later. So I wondered if you could start with kind of a report card on the Duterte administration. So Duterte campaigned on, a number of issues, but amongst the main issues that he campaigned on when he ran for office were to have a war on drugs, to fight corruption. He had a kind of semi-populist economic message, and he claimed that he was going to reshape the US-Philippine relationship. So I'm wondering if you could touch briefly on those and any other kind of points that you think in terms of that would be relevant in just giving the Duterte administration a grade on what they did compared to what he said he was going to do, separate from, whether you think it was good or not.
Yes, well, let me begin first by looking at some of the more subliminal factors that brought Duterte to power. Because unless we can understand the social psychological part of it, it might not be that useful to do a report card. But let's see. Well, Duterte came to power in the Philippines in 2016. And I called it an electoral insurgency. The context in which he came to power was widespread disillusionment with, the 30 years of the EDSA Republic. Now, what we need to understand there is that, enshrined in the EDSA Constitution of 1987 was, a lot of human rights, social rights, democratic rights language. And of course, coming out of the Marcos dictatorship, the promise never to, again, submit the country to the rule of human rights violators. But after 30 years, there was just, a great deal of disillusionment that had not delivered. It was just one faction of the elite succeeding another. A lot of promises about reform, none fulfilled. And so by the end of that, about 30% of the population remained under poverty with very high levels of inequality. And the economy of the Philippines totally transformed in a neoliberal direction, and the death of manufacturing, and a crisis in agriculture, and sending workers abroad, became, the main mechanism to be able to grow the economy. Okay, so that's the context in which this electoral insurgency took place. Now, Duterte ran as essentially a one-issue candidate, and he was really focused on, the idea that drugs were the bane of life, and that he promised a bloody reign. That he was going to get rid of the criminals, and especially of the drug users. And he basically said, that I'm going to fill, this is almost a direct quote, the waters of Manila Bay with the cadavers or the corpses of this of criminals. Okay, so now there certainly was a certain appeal, I would say, of the fight against crime. Okay, I think that was a cross-class appeal, but that especially appealed to the elite and the middle class. So that's there. I think that yes, he said he was going to do away with corruption, but it was sort of a secondary thing that came in, and then there was also the sense that he was going to do some real change in the economic system. He would fight the oligarchy. But again, this was a subsidiary theme. And I think what was happening here was people reading into Duterte what they wanted to read. Okay, and that if they were very much for social change in terms of structural change in the economy, redistribution, they sort of read that into him. And many people who belong to the progressive movement sort of fell into that kind of reading of Duterte. And of course, people who were so sick of corruption read that into him. And then the thing is this: when we try to deconstruct the charismatic appeal of Duterte, what I found is really this, that people may not agree with many of the things he said or promised, but if there were this one or two points that people felt very important, they were willing to just focus on those and sort of not care too much about what was happening elsewhere. I just wanted to give you an example. For instance, a number of former progressives would say that, would focus on the promise of structural change. But when you brought up the whole thing, what about all these murders that are taking place? People would sort of just brush that aside and focus on what they really wanted and hope that Duterte would do. So we cannot, as I said, John, we cannot eliminate the dynamics of charismatic appeal here of Duterte, and not reduce this whole thing just to a rational analysis of why he came to power. So, but to come now to your question, after 5 years, where are we? Well, we have, if there's one thing on which Duterte has delivered, it's to kill people. Okay, and I mean, that was the one thing he said: I'm going to get rid of the criminals and I'm going to kill them. And the estimate is that more than 20,000 Filipinos have been subjected to extrajudicial killing. Okay, so the height of this was in 2016, 2017, and part of 2018. So the second thing that we need to see is that, yes, Duterte had mentioned, that he was going to deal with corruption, but towards the end of his term, we now have these big scandals. The Farmally scandal, whereby cronies of Duterte cornered, the budget for personal protective equipment, overpriced, and made millions of pesos out of it. And now the next thing that's happening right now is the Malampaya oil gas, natural gas fields, that are a national resource, have been practically given over to Dennis Uy, who is a crony of Duterte. So on the one hand, there's the promise of dealing away with corruption has fallen apart in terms of the actual performance, and you do have a resurgence of crony capitalism that that has occurred. Duterte had said that he was fighting the oligarchs. Yes, he shut down ABS-CBN, but that wasn't so much because of fighting the oligarchs, but because he was really pissed off at ABS-CBN for his thinking that they were quite unfair to him in the lead up to the 2016 elections. But the long and the short of that is that he might have, instilled some fear into some of the big oligarchs, but he's created, cronies of his own, and very much many of them, having, strong links to China. Now, as to the so-called progressive parts of Duterte that I think fooled, to be honest, fooled quite a number of people. He said he was anti-mining. That was dropped very early on. And basically the country has become very much continuing in a very intensive mining policy. He said that he would do away with contractualization of workers. That was also dropped. Like he basically said, no, this is something that contractualization must go on, and that was important because that was one of his promises. The third one was in his inaugural speech. He was very not inaugural, victory speech in Davao in 2016. He devoted about 15 minutes to attacking the World Trade Organization, saying it was the bane, it had created the problems of farmers. Well, once in office, he forgot all about that, and he approved the Rice Tariffication Act, which was a demand of the World Trade Organization, to end the quota on rice. And now, I think not even established economists can dispute the fact that it is the prime source of the creation of poverty among farmers has been just the elimination of the controls over rice imports. So I would say, therefore, that we have had a regime that has been marked by the spilling of blood. It has engaged in its own brand of corruption and crony capitalism, and it has gone back on all the seemingly progressive promises that that were there from the start. And of course, the one thing that I must mention is that the neoliberal framework of the Philippines, in which everything has been completely, not completely, but the dismantling of state controls, on the freedom of the market, has persisted under Duterte. He has not changed the neoliberal framework. He, in fact, said from the very beginning of his reign that he would just adopt the economic framework of the Aquino administration that preceded him. And of course, what does this neoliberal framework mean? It means really you keep wages down in order to attract investors, as they say. You make sure that you dismantle, the tariff structure, and you promote, the entry of foreign investment, and you don't undertake any redistributionist policies. Okay, about 700,000 hectares of land that are supposed to be subjected to land reform remain as very much under the control of landlords. So all redistributionist efforts or goals just have been put on hold, you know. So so we now have the, you know, this is the record of the Duterte administration that I would say is it's been, I mean, if you look at it from the aspirations of Filipino people, I think it has really, there's been a big gap between its promises and the actual performance. Okay, so I would just stop there for the time being.
Great, thanks. You started with a historical discussion, and so I wonder if we could pick that up a little bit, in the sense that we also have one of the recurring themes during the Duterte administration was, you know, how to think about the Marcos era and martial law, and the whole debate about interring Marcos in, you know, the pantheon of heroes and so forth. And the Philippines was an example of a country that never had really a national reckoning with the Marcos dictatorship and the martial law period in the way, say, South Africa did with its Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and a number of Latin American countries had. And we see, you know, now the son of the former dictator is, you know, ran for vice president previously and is going to be running in this election. So I'm wondering if you could just, and you raised already the kind of the context of like the 30 years of the EDSA block. There's also kind of this Marcos legacy block, for the lack of a better term. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the broader dynamics of kind of these two competing blocks in the Philippines, and what might be, you know, how they're playing, how those blocks are kind of playing themselves out.
Well, you know, I think the Marcos, Bongbong Marcos is, as you said, running for president, and he's running on, you know, the idea that somehow under his father there was a golden age. And you know, of course, we don't even mention the lie that he has, that he was educated at Oxford, or the hundreds of millions, if not billions, of pesos and dollars that you know, that is in concealed wealth. You know, the estimate is between $5 to $10 billion dollars. You know, continues to be unaccounted for. But over the last few years, there was this effort, which included even trying to get Cambridge Analytica to refurbish the image of the Marcoses. You know, it's been a sort of an internet campaign to prettify what were, you know, some of the worst years of the Philippines, and to try to convert that into a golden age. Now, you know, for a lot of Filipinos, especially the younger generations, you know, I mean, you're probably talking about 45 to 50%, you know, who were either very, very young during the Marcos period or had not yet been born. So they had no direct experience of it. But what they have a direct experience of has been 1986 up till today. And I think there has been this big gap between the promise of EDSA, or the promise of the so-called EDSA uprising, and the actual delivery of results. So basically, I think, therefore, you have this two, you know, competing legacies, as you said. On the one hand, there's the Marcos legacy, which really was a very terrible period, but which is now being prettified. And on the other hand, there is the legacy of EDSA, in which there were unfulfilled promises and a lot of hypocrisy, you know, as to the aims of different administrations. So I would say that if you bring out all the facts, I mean, there's just no way that you could have a situation where there were thousands of human rights violations, during that the period of the Marcos dictatorship. I believe the statistics are there were something like around 70,000 imprisonments, over 3,000 dead, and then thousands of incidents of human rights violations. We had a law that was passed, and I was one of the principal authors in Congress, called the Human Rights Compensation Law, Marcos Compensation Law. And under that, so that the Swiss government had seized Marcos assets in Switzerland, amounting to something like over $300 million, and turned it over to the Philippine government, and the Philippine Supreme Court ratified that as the property of the people because it had been stolen by Marcos. And what happened was, out of that fund, we established a commission that would look into compensation. And there were 70,000 applicants, for that. Because the money was really quite limited, there were about 11,000, over 11,000 applications for compensation that were eventually approved. So I'm just saying this because if you want records about what happened during the period, there is a wealth in this commission, and it's under it's kept in the records of the Commission for Human Rights. If you look at the economy, my God, it was a disaster. Marcos left office with about $26 billion in debt, to the international banks. And what happened was, part of the reason, that the performance of the EDSA Republic was meager was because so much of the resources of the country was spent on repaying that foreign debt that was left, by the Marcos regime, because you really had banks backed by the U.S. Treasury Department, basically telling the Cory Aquino administration, you have to be, this has to be repaid. And the strategy of the Aquino administration, despite the fact that even many established economists were saying, don't do it, was to be a good model, or what they called a model debtor strategy, which is do whatever the banks want. And so what we had, therefore, was resources that could have gone to development, because of the weakness of the administration of Cory Aquino, and the fact that it was also filled by neoliberals. Resources that should have gone to development went into repaying the debt. And so, if you look at what happened between, I think, 1986 and around 2005, 2006, over the 20-year period, the Philippines, if I'm not mistaken, had a growth rate of 1.6% annually. It was the second to the lowest in Southeast Asia for that period. These are UN statistics, it's not surprising that that would happen because of the priority that was given to foreign debt repayment. We even had a law, the Automatic Appropriations Law, one of the few countries in the world that said you have to put the first cut in terms of the budget in repaying creditors. And only after then can you spend the rest of the budget on the needs of the country. So essentially, what you had was capital expenditures as as a mechanism for development was very, very weak. And as we all know, the government is the biggest investor in any economy, and if government investment is so weak because so much of it is being channeled to repaying foreign debt, it will show. It will show in the loss of infrastructural dynamism, in terms of building up social infrastructure, social welfare, and that showed during that period. So coming back to the point is that for a certain segment of the population that has not experienced the Marcos period, they might be beguiled by the fact that there is this campaign going on to paint the Marcos period as the golden era. And they might be permeable to that. That's understandable, okay? But it's important during this period of time when Bongbong Marcos is running to tell the truth about this family. As I said in a television interview just last week, it was a controversial one. I said that this family raped the country. It has not apologized. Now, Marcos wants to rape the country again. And I will not mention what I said after that. But everybody in the Philippines knows that at this point in time. But that's essentially, we have to tell the reality to people about what happened during that dark era. And I think as long as people get exposed to that, and I have experienced this with younger people that I've talked to, once they realize what really happened, then they're not easy to prey to the propaganda that is coming out. So that's why, I may be going ahead of myself, but we plan to use the campaign to be able to expose the sins of the Marcos family. Okay, this is part of what's going to happen during this campaign is a full-scale expose of the Marcos family.
So one more question before I ask you specifically about the campaign, is if you could touch a little bit on Philippine-U.S. relations under Duterte. So one of the areas he was very, rhetorically very critical of U.S. policy, and at least early on in his administration, was very adamant that there was going to be a restructuring of the U.S.-Philippines relationship, and said that the Philippines should ally much more closely with China, particularly on issues relating to investment, and refused to kind of use the International Tribunal decision around in the South China Sea against China. So I'm curious what your assessment was of, at the end of the day, really how much, if any, was there kind of a reconfiguration of the U.S.-Philippine relationship, and where do you kind of see things going?
Well, with respect to the distancing from the United States, I think that was mainly rhetorical. All the mechanisms of subordination of the Philippines to the United States are there. The Visiting Forces Agreement, the Mutual Defense Treaty, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which has really have tied the Philippines structurally to the U.S. military strategy in the Pacific. Duterte had said back in 2020 that he was going to abolish the Visiting Forces Agreement, which had allowed for the training of by American Marines and others of Philippine troops, sort of joint exercises. At that time, I wrote an article saying Duterte is a mass murderer, but I agree with him in ending the Visiting Forces Agreement. And so he didn't follow through on that. Basically, over the last, month, he has affirmed, the Visiting Forces Agreement as as one of the key pillars of the Philippine-U.S. relations. So basically, there was a rhetorical distancing, but in the end, they've become much closer, closer again. With respect to China, yes, there's been almost a very shameful kind of subordination to China in terms of being very worried about what the Chinese or Xi Jinping would feel. Okay, and what we've in fact seen is that for a number of reasons, but especially because I think the economic largesse that China presents, Duterte has not wanted to destabilize that. He has basically subordinated the Philippines policy in the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea to the desires of Beijing. As you know, he did not really, was not very eager to follow through with the Hague decision that basically invalidated China's maritime claims in the area, including its claiming that 90% of the South China Sea, or West Philippine Sea as we call it, was China's domestic territory. Okay, so that was one thing. So he promised that he would go to the Spratlys. He even made a joke out of it that he would jet ski to the Spratlys to defend Philippine sovereignty. And he, and then at another point, he said he would go to Pag-asa, the Philippine island in the Spratlys, and he said, that he would raise the Philippine flag there. And he went back on both of those because China basically, felt, that this would be acts that would, that basically the Chinese did not want him to be doing. So it's been, and people have sort of have seen through this, and Duterte always position has been, if I, do you want me to go to war with China? Okay, and no, of course not. But we at least, want to make sure you assert the sovereign rights of the Philippines. Okay, and at some point he says that, okay, I've done that, but it's without any sort of enthusiasm. And I think largely people see him as being subordinate to China in this in when it comes to the Spratlys, when it comes to the South China Sea, and when it comes to coddling many economic interests and cronies that are quite close to China. Now, the larger picture with respect to the South China Sea and the U.S.-Philippine, U.S.-China struggle in the area, we can discuss that in another context. But the point is that what a lot of people have been asking is this: the Aquino administration was so pro-US. Okay, then we have another administration that tried to tilt the other way and being pro-Beijing. And what people have been saying basically is that, why don't we have an independent foreign policy instead of tilting this way and that way, and becoming used by both sides in a very explosive situation at this point in time. The epicenter of possible conflicts, global conflicts, the most dangerous spot in the world today is the South China Sea. And it's, as the Vietnamese told me when I was still in Congress and I went to visit Vietnam, a mere ship collision, say between a ship of the United States and a ship of China could easily escalate into, just, a higher form of warfare because there are no rules. And, if you look at what's happening there at this point, they are playing chicken, okay? The idea of, surveilling one another, getting close to one another, and then at the last minute swerving, okay? Now that kind of macho, competition is being displayed in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea at this point in time, and it is dangerous. It is very dangerous. So that's the larger context of that's the larger context of the Duterte, China, U.S. triangle.
Great, thank you. So now I want to come to your specific campaign. You and Caliotti de Guzman just released your platform this past Saturday, if I recall, called Bagong Politika, Bagong Ekonomiya, New Politics, New Economy. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of the broad framework of the campaign, and also why perhaps you've chosen to kind of, one of the other, I know, questions that was discussions that was in the context of the broad opposition to Duterte was, the desire to have some kind of unified kind of opposition candidate, and at least some groups lined up behind the current vice president, Lenin Robredo, as kind of that candidate. So I'm curious if you could talk both about kind of the decision to, be involved in the own campaign, and then the broad parameters of what you see as the platform for the campaign.
Yes, well, basically, what Laban and Masa, which is the coalition that I'm involved with, has really wanted to transform the arena of foreign politics, of politics in the Philippines, of electoral politics, from one that is centered on personalities to one that really focuses on programs. What do you offer in terms of taxes, in terms of agricultural reform, in terms of industrial reform. And we crafted for the last several months, because we felt that programmatic change, that should be the focus of elections. We crafted, initially what was a 25-point program. It is now a 13-point program that addresses key dimensions of national existence and proposes the kinds of reforms that really need to be done. And I would just say that it is a program that is both socialist and democratic. Okay, and we feel that we are taking on key issues that many of the other candidates would rather not address. Okay, because it would involve major issues of income and wealth redistribution. Okay, so that's sort of the priority that we had when it came to the elections, is to craft a program that we can then discuss with the people in competition with others, and say, okay, what do they offer aside from I am the best candidate, so that was the first thing. We wanted a program so that we could get away from the focus on personalities. Secondly, the concern about having a unified candidate for the opposition, certainly that's something we share. Okay, and however, we have our request to have a discussion with the Vice President, Lenin Robredo, was there over the last 3.5 months. And we've not received any responses. I mean, it's just to see if there are elements of the program that are commonly shared. But if you don't receive any response, I mean, we're not going to wait forever in the antechamber. Okay, and unfortunately, that is what other groups have experienced. And the third thing is that the elections are 7 months away. We don't have a primary system in the Philippines, okay? But we can have the next best thing to a primary system, which is in the first few months, let's get out to, let's compete to show the people, what we're all about, our own records, okay? And then make them decide, and we'll begin to see during this process who is a better candidate, okay? Basically, this is the way you did it in the US through the primaries. We don't have that, but we can have an approximation of that, so that to say at this point that, hey, you're dividing the opposition, why don't you just give up? It's too premature, and it's just sort of aborts this process that of political maturation that really needs to take place. Okay, so the third thing is you cannot just run on a platform of human rights or protection of due process and democratic rights. When you're up, against the Marcos Duterte axis of evil, as I call it, you have to offer not just opposition to the kind of policies that they represent and the authoritarianism that they represent, but a transformative vision for Philippine society. So it's linked. Your ability to win an election should not be divorced from the kind of program and the record, that you offer. Okay, so because if you separate those two, I think you're really exposing yourself to losing, the election. So let me just say that personally speaking, I have a great deal of respect for the vice president. Okay, and she knows that. I've said that several times. But I think that she does have to get out of her circle of advisors because I think she has a cordon sanitaire that would much rather have her talk to traditional politicians than reach out to her real allies, which is us, people like us. Okay, so so that's the and if that were to be the case of reaching out to us, she wouldn't make mistakes like filling half or more than half of her senatorial slate with traditional politicians, many of whom have had corruption cases filed against them. So if you're going to run for office and you have the baggage of traditional politicians with you that are in your Senate slate, that's not a very good approach, both morally as well strategically. So so these are some of the lessons. These are some of the reasons why we're running. We will present a program. We present our own personal political records, and then as the campaign progresses, let's see. Okay, let's see what happens. It could very well happen that the Robredo Pangilinan ticket decides that the Leo de Guzman Walden Bello ticket is more likely to win the election and withdraw in our favor. I mean, people may laugh at that now, but hey, politics is an everyday affair. It continually changes. There's a lot of fluidity, and what's going to be there in December or January may be a very different situation that from what is happening now. So that's just a short, long answer to your question.
No, that's great. And I think, after nobody expected Duterte to win the election, certainly nobody in the US expected Donald Trump to be a nominee, let alone a president. So the idea that things, it's anyone who can say I can absolutely predict that something is or isn't going to happen, I think there's not a lot of evidence for that. So I'm going to turn this over to some of the questions from folks in the audience. And there was a relatively straightforward question around Duterte and Beijing. Do you know if there's any truth to allegations that a bit of the funding for his campaign came from China-based tycoons and hence his meekness in the face of China's bullying?
Well, let me answer that, but as far as I know, in terms of hard evidence, I don't see that at this point. But is it possible? Yes, he's quite close to Chinese billionaires and to the government in Beijing. So so no hard evidence, but I'll not be surprised if there is in fact a hard link.
I'm wondering if I'm going to throw, while I wait for other folks to throw questions into the Q&A box, I'm wondering if you can talk about what what implications have there been of the announcement of the investigation into Duterte at the International Criminal Court, and how do you think that's going to be an issue in the campaign, and just how had that whole announcement played out in terms of Philippine politics?
Well, I think that it is an issue, and we're going to make it an issue. And in our program, we basically said that we will immediately begin judicial proceedings against Duterte, and part of these judicial proceedings will be to cooperate with the International Criminal Court in terms of investigating the thousands of extrajudicial executions. So it will be an issue. Of course, there will be parts of the Duterte base won't like this, of course, but we are determined to make it an issue. It is an issue right now, and I think we will be able to win the electorate over to having the by then ex-president subject to judicial prosecution.
Great. So we have another question. Excuse me, from an anonymous attendee. Do you see any prospects for the Philippine left to coalesce or unite in the future?
Well, I would say that this is first of all, I think that the Philippine left, or the different groups within the Philippine left, must really undergo a process of introspection, okay, in terms of the strategies that they have offered to the people. I can only speak that Laban ng Masa and the organizations under it have, in fact, subjected the experience of the left in the Philippines to this kind of discussion and introspection. And this is why we have focused on having this program, to be presented to people. We are quite strong about labeling our program socialist and democratic, because there are people who would say, oh my God, don't even mention socialism, okay? And we are taking on the issues that really affect the people, including controversial ones, like, we want to end all discrimination against the LGBTQIA community, okay? And of course, this is a controversial one. we're saying decriminalize abortion. Okay, so basically we're bringing out issues that in the past progressives sort of did not want to address, but which were trying to be addressed. So we're basically saying that the best way to be able to win the people is by explaining your program to them, not by becoming a tale of some traditional politician and hanging on to the coattails of such politicians in order to be an effective force electorally or within Philippine politics as it is. So my sense, therefore, in answer to that question is yes, I would hope that the Philippine left would coalesce in the future, but I would not encourage any illusions that it will be an easy process. But as far as our own sector of the left is concerned, we do feel that we have to change the way that the progressive movement approaches the people and have more faith in the people that they will see why we are offering this program that focuses on both the political and economic redistribution of power. And we've seen that in the United States, with the progressives like Bernie Sanders coming, hey, stop using this socialist word as a bogey. I am a socialist. Alexandra Cortez is a socialist, okay? And they're proud of it. And that whole process itself begins to disarm and to erode the so-called anti-communist or anti-socialist prejudices of the population. So as far as we're concerned, we're going to use these elections as an educational process for the people. And we're looking forward to it. It's not easy. It's not easy. Okay, but we're definitely looking forward to using this as an educational process about how to transform politics in the Philippines.
Great. I want to pick up on the question that you've raised a couple of times now about the effort to build a more programmatic politics. And so Meredith Weiss had a question: to what extent or where do you hope or expect that a more programmatic focus might percolate through elections for lower tiers of government? That there seem to be, roadblocks at the national level in particular to, programmatic alternatives to populist or personally driven politics. Might we also see spaces at lower levels of government for the emergence of programmatic politics?
Yes, I think definitely one would have to approach this at the local level, the meso level, and the national level at the same time. But we need to basically address the issue of class power because you may have a law like we have in the Philippines about decentralizing power, decentralizing, and making the lower levels more responsible for the budgetary process and giving them, the wherewithal, what was once determined nationally, a lot of that resources being determined locally. But the problem is that if you don't change elite politics, the local elites are going to be in control of any sort of decentralized process. And this has happened in the Philippines. Decentralization has not meant, a better deal, for the people. It has just strengthened local elites because it has given them, access to a greater part of the government budget. So we have to address that issue. I think we cannot, otherwise decentralization becomes just a very formal kind of process. Okay, and so we're again in the realm of how do we break class power? Okay, and that has to be really the key issue that has to be addressed. If we are able to be transformative in that area, then most of the rest of the blocks, are technical in nature. and in solution. Okay, but if we don't break class power, everything with respect to decentralization becomes a very formal process. Just to give you an example, the party list law in the Philippines was supposed to mainly allow marginalized sectors to politically organize so that they could elect their representatives to Congress. What has happened is that the local elites in the Philippines have basically taken over the party list. So they've created all this, party lists that are really fake party lists, like security guards, party list, so and so party list, nice attractive names, but it is local elites. The party list system has become another channel through which local elites have inserted themselves into the national political process at the level of the House of Representatives. So I just wanted to give you that example that even seemingly progressive laws like the party list system, which really was used in the early era to be able to elect people to Congress from marginalized sectors, even those have now become shut, except in the case of several party lists, that continue to be promote people's welfare. So again, changes in the law without making real changes in the structure of power can be very deceptive in terms of their implications and consequences.
Great. Another question from an attendee. Do you expect a last-minute substitution from the Duterte family? I assume they mean either Sarah running for president, or is it possible that Rodrigo may try to go against the spirit of the Constitution? I assume they mean that he might put himself up for vice president, even though he's said that he will not do that. So just your thoughts on if you think there'll be a last minute, because for November 15th, right, is the last date for declaring candidates.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation at this point. Everything is possible at this point, and we need to be really ready for last minute substitution, say of Sarah to run for either president or vice president. I anticipate that there is going to be there probably might be some sort of formal type of tandem between the Marcoses and the Dutertes, because their interests are so much aligned. But I'm not going to the business of predicting what exactly would be the form of this tandem. So the situation is this, that Bongbong Marcos wants desperately to be vice president. President. Duterte wants very much to make sure that he finds a way to hold on to power, if only so that he doesn't get sent to The Hague, okay, to the International Criminal Court. So there's a lot of different machinations that is taking place, but at the same time, the ambitions of people in the Duterte camp have made any resolution very difficult, because people who used to be allied with Duterte, like Pacquiao, like Lacson, or even Moreno, who wants to be a Duterte 2.0, are now have made the maneuvers more difficult for a straightforward Duterte kind of succession, because of the splits that it has created. And what I'd just like to say with respect to this is, Lacson, for instance, and Pacquiao are now saying that they're running as opposition, but just a few months ago, they were among the strongest allies of Duterte. But, so I'm just saying that the personal ambitions of people in the Duterte camp has made things more complicated for a Duterte, either a Duterte succession or a succession that would preserve Duterte's hold on power.
Another question, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how Duterte approached the CPP-NPA insurgency over the course of this time. And one of the questions are, what is your platform with respect to dealing with the insurgency if you were to be elected?
Okay. Well, this is something that is much studied, and I think there are people that said that when he was mayor of Davao, Duterte, was very open to finding ways to work with the CPP-NPA and not making Davao a free fire zone between the military and the CPP-NPA. When Duterte came to power, you even had a situation then whereby certain sectors that were seen as being part of the National Democratic Front entered government as cabinet ministers, so there was a bit of a honeymoon there, and there were peace talks that begun, and then the next phase was their leaving government and the peace talks being stymied, and then extrajudicial executions of activists that the military was trying to pin down as really the CPP-NPA, but which I don't think was true. So that's where we are right now. And I think here it is important to realize that when it comes to relations with the CPP-NPA, that's been the military's, the role of the military has been very great. That basically, they've told Duterte, we'll support you, but you have to make sure, that, you won't accommodate these enemies of ours. So the military there, I think, put its foot down on any sort of continuing negotiations for a peace treaty or a peace accord between the NPA, CPP-NPA, and the military. But the main thing at this point is, that over the last year, the focus of Duterte's repression, backed by the military and the police, has become people associated, or the military wants to associate with the left. Okay, Duterte has become very solid in his opposition at this point to any kind of openings, any kind of discussions with the CPP-NPA or sectors that are related to them. So but with respect to our program, I think that we need to resume those discussions. Okay, that government and the traditional left, to call it that, should begin these discussions again on a peace accord, and that it would be very important to rein in the influence of the military when it comes to this, that the military should not be allowed to disrupt or destroy this process. It's, of course, negotiations are going to take, it's not easy, but, but there, how can you have breakthroughs when you don't negotiate in the first place? Okay, so it is really the military that holds the veto power over what happens in the relationship between the government and the traditional left.
Great. So another question: what are the prospects that there's a danger of another civil war in the event that another Marcos occupies the presidential palace?
Okay, well, I said that I made a Facebook post that basically that this is going to trigger civil war. I am worried about that because you really have significant sectors of the population that suffered under Marcos that would not would look very, very very scornfully if Marcos were to come to power, another Marcos were to come to power again. It would be, in their view, a recreation of the nightmare. Okay, I myself, would be extremely upset if this happened. And I know that I said there that many of us would rather die than have somebody like Marcos, come to power. Allowing for a bit of exaggeration, of course, in cases like those, and sometimes I tend to exaggerate, but the reality is that a lot of people will be upset. And I think the best way to prevent this kind of trigger into civil conflict is by not voting for this guy in the first place. Okay, some people would not allow a repeat of the Marcos years, and are determined to make sure that doesn't happen. Mainly because why should you vote for somebody who is out to destroy democracy? Okay, so democracy must be able to protect itself from people who use the democratic process to gain authoritarian power. We must never forget that Hitler first came to power through democratic means in 1932 to 1933. But once he was in power, then he began very quickly dismantling the institutions of democracy. I think that is the danger that is going to happen if Bongbong Marcos were to win the elections. But having said that, he's not going to make it. He won't win. The Filipino people are much too mature to allow this, what you call it now. I don't want to use another curse word, because I don't want another instance where I would have to say that it was the devil that made me say those words, just like Jimmy Swaggart, the evangelical, when he was confronted with his sexual scandals, he said, "The devil made me do it." Okay, but I mean, on my part, it's a joke, because I mean, of course, the important thing is that when I use those words, suddenly all throughout the country, there was this explosion of people through tweets and everything saying, "Hey, you said the right thing. The guy deserves it. The family deserves it." And if there's anybody who deserves that kind of statement, it's the Marcoses. So, but I don't want to use that again. But certainly, I was asked in one interview, if I were elected vice president and he were elected president, would I work with him? No, I'd punch him in the face.
So I would pay for that. Yes. So you mentioned the media, and I wanted to discuss on that because you mentioned earlier, the Duterte administration has had kind of a dual approach to the media. One is kind of repression, And you mentioned the closing down of ABS-CBN, and of course the harassment of Rappler, and so forth. And the other side is that the Duterte, both during the election and as governing, has used social media, and kind of misinformation and so forth has been an active element of kind of its pro-Duterte forces in terms of governing. How do you see kind of the moving forward, kind of the role of social media in the election, and the challenges that both attacks on the media and media freedom as well as misinformation will play out in the election?
Well, I think just as in other countries like India and in Europe, the far right has, been able to really use media in a very effective way, to be able to promote their ideas, and of course, whether we like it or not, Facebook has not intervened in this process, or what is it called now? Something, Meta or something, but basically Facebook has been accomplished in terms of the far right gaining, such a dominant role in terms of promoting hate speech, fake news, and all of that stuff. So the Philippines has been an example to that. Okay, I mean, the far right has been, Duterte's people have been far more agile at using the social media, for trolling, and there are a lot of trolls. That's one thing. But of course, we should not go overboard. There are also a lot of true believers, so and true believers, you need to engage in conversations, not condemn them. But trolls, you can easily spot the trolls, and those are the people with scripted responses to you. So that's the first thing that I would say. In terms of the repression of the media, Rappler and ABS-CBN, well, we've seen that. We've the weaponization of the law to be able to not only put people like Laila de Lima in jail, but to try to shut down Rappler, and they were able to shut down the ABS-CBN. Okay, so that's there, but not all the problems with the media are Duterte related. Okay, and we're experiencing this right now. The media in the Philippines, unfortunately, does not do a good job in terms of being a process, a mechanism of education. Okay, for instance, the Manila Bulletin, when it says who will you vote for vice president, it excluded me. Others exclude Paliodi. Okay, so there is a narrow, what the media is doing is presenting that these are the only worthwhile candidates, which are, the same Tom, Dick, Harry, whatever, who are really just running as personalities. And people that would like to break this process and bring programs, the media sort of ignores. So basically, it's a very undemocratic process whereby they frame the arena for the population. Okay, and so it's a very subtle but very undemocratic process to say that these are the only people that are worthwhile. Okay, and we are not going to take that sitting down. And we'll need to break that kind of media monopoly on who's a worthwhile candidate and who's not a worthwhile candidate. Okay, but I just wanted to say, therefore, that yes, a lot of problems in the Philippines are Duterte related, but not all. Okay, and unfortunately, some of the media that pass themselves off as neutral and liberal, I think in indirect ways structure the situation for the electorate in a very negative way.
Great. So we have a question from our colleagues at ABS-CBN. Don Tagal is asking, what do your internal polls show about your and your presidential candidate's chance of winning the election in 2022? Duterte won with only 16 million votes in a crowded field. So why run now and join an already crowded slate of presidential and VP candidates?
Well, I must confess, Don, we haven't had the resources to conduct internal polls at this point. And I doubt whether we will have the resources to do that. Given the fact that we have to scarce resources, we have to really devote to the campaign rather than polling. As you know. So all I can say is that we're confident that as our candidacy begins to reach people and it gathers momentum and it begins to attract especially young people, which we've been attracting in droves at this point in time, that there will be that process, whereby the momentum, creates affiliation, support, and mobilizes people. Now, where does that bring us? All we can say is, that we're confident that after a few months, we won't be an insignificant force. Okay, but hopefully, that will become a real alternative to what's happening right now in terms of the way that politics is done in the Philippines.
Great. There's a question about constitutional reforms that basically, in recent years, there have been proposals to turn the Philippines into a federal system and into a parliamentary system. So, what's your sense of the viability of those reforms and the desirability of those reforms?
Well, I think the current constitutional system in the Philippines is definitely not perfect. Okay, but I have questions whether changing from a presidential to a parliamentary system is going to do the trick. I think again the problem is not so much the political but the social power, of the elites. We've seen it with the party list law. If you have a parliamentary system, supposing it wins out in discussions, I can see also major efforts by the elites to adapt to a parliamentary system that will continue to exclude, people, or the masses from being represented, but mainly apportions, seats according to dynastic interests. So again, I know that there are many people who believe in a parliamentary system as the mechanism of reform. All I can say is that we need to study this more, but always be very careful, that we focus, we don't make hopes of being able to reform the social distribution of power in the Philippines through a mere change from a presidential to a parliamentary system, because elites can easily adapt. We have to be able to break the power of the billionaires and the rich and the powerful. That has to be the key. And then I think that formal changes in the constitutional system, will follow, what needs to be done. Okay, so that's my sense. Now, the greater danger at this point is all those efforts over the last few years, to denationalize the Philippine Constitution and make it more easy for foreigners to own strategic sectors of the economy, and the do away with the ownership rules that favors foreign nationals. There have been constant efforts to try to do this, or to use or to pass constitutional changes that would deregulate and make privatization much easier, and of course monopolization much easier. So those are more of the immediate dangers at this point in time, are those laws that would liberalize foreign investment and foreign ownership of key sectors of the economy.
As we're moving into wrapping up, I'm wondering if you could just identify what you think ultimately Duterte's biggest legacies are going to be. You know, once he leaves office, what positive, negative, whatever, what do you see his legacies?
Oh, well, I think, the weakening of the culture of human rights in the Philippines, and it's not so much when you call it human rights as formal rights, but the naturally sympathetic nature of Filipinos and their ability to be able to understand the sufferings of people. Duterte has sort of bastardized that. He has made killing of people without due process, legitimate. So I think he's gone against the traditional Filipino focus on the sanctity of life. Okay, and I think that is the worst legacy that is leaving the country, is to say that the value of a Filipino life, the value of a lower class life, is no more than that of a chicken. Okay, and I think that is the kind of gangster mentality that unfortunately has permeated, or he has promoted that kind of thing. Maybe not not conspiratorially, but certainly by example. And so that's why, and of course there are the weakening of the institutions of due process, the separation of powers. So these are the negative legacies of this administration. Positive legacy, I really don't see any. There was, at first I was thinking that he would move away from the United States and try to pursue an independent foreign policy. And this was when he said that he was going to cancel the visiting forces agreement. And I wrote a controversial article where I said Duterte may be a mass murderer, but he's right on canceling the VFA. Okay, and he didn't follow through on that. He in his usual fashion, rhetoric and then reconciliation. So that's and then a culture of lying, where basically he thinks that it is natural to be able to lie, and then to say later on that, oh, I was just joking, or to tell people that, yes, I promised to go to the Spratlys, but hey, that was just for the elections. So just this, the way that he has made truth a very flexible commodity, that you bend the truth, or you even destroy the truth whenever it suits you. But so you know, this is the legacy that this person leaves behind. And of course, you know, I say good riddance, and I hope to see you in The Hague.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank everyone for attending this webinar today. I'd like to thank Matthew Nickdow and Emily Tumale for their support and logistics in making this happen. A thank you also to my colleague Luis Francia, the co-director of the steering committee for the SULO initiative, Philippine Studies Initiative at NYU, and the other two co-sponsors, the New York Southeast Asia Network and the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies. Thank you all very much. A recording of the webinar will be posted on the Sulu website eventually and will be made available. And Walden, thank you again very much.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank the program as well as NYU for you know, hosting this. It's been a very illuminating conversation. And hopefully we will have more of this in the process of the next 7 months of the elections, because I think it's conversations like this that will open people's minds, you know. And I think the politicians, the Marcoses, are underestimating the Filipino people. You know, they think that the Filipino people can be fooled and bribed, you know, and pay $500 for a vote. I think they'll be facing a surprise in these elections.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And we'll see you at our next webinar. Take care.